What is intergenerational trauma? Intergenerational trauma is the passing of psychological effects of trauma, such as injury, violence, or poverty, from one generation to the next. This transmission is believed to be epigenetic, affecting gene expression rather than genes themselves. The resulting impacts may include anxiety, shame, depression, low self-esteem, substance abuse, relationship difficulties, and a heightened stress reaction. The population that our group has chosen to explore intergenerational trauma through are Indigenous peoples in North America, which refers to the first inhabitants of the land in the United States and Canada. Within North America, there are American Indians, Alaska Native, First Nations, Inuit, and Metis communities. Many different languages are spoken, and each group and tribe has a unique cultural identity, social structure, spiritual system, etc. Following the population, there are some key terms to keep in mind in relation to this population. So as I mentioned previously, Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Aboriginal peoples, and Native peoples are typically the people who descend from the original inhabitants of a region, often used in a global context. So specifically, we're looking at North America. Another reference for this population is American Indian or Alaska Native, which are typically those members of federally recognized tribes, nations, or communities in the U.S. These terms are often preferred in government contexts, and a person's specific tribal affiliation should be used when possible. Lastly, we have the Inuit and Metis, which are two distinct Indigenous groups in Canada. So following those key terms, we do have the region, and that region is North America. So in North America, you're going to see a map that may not look like your typical map that we look at, but it does include what present-day Canada looks like, as well as the United States, but through the tribes that reside in those specific areas, which is very cool. So live across the North American continent, we are looking at the Arctic region of Alaska and northern Canada, through the plains, the Pacific Northwest, the Great Lakes, the Southwest, Southeast, and Eastern woodlands. So these are typically the regions that we're going to be specifying and expanding on. So, what types of collective trauma has the population possibly encountered? As we know, this population in specific has experienced and endured a lot of different types of trauma. Specifically, four stood out to me in my research. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with colonization and land dispossession. European colonization included forced removal from ancestral lands, disruption of traditions and traditional ways of life, alongside the loss of sovereignty and resources. History of systemic oppression and racism have heavily shaped ongoing disparities in health, wealth, and social status, which, as we all agree, continues today through capitalism. Following colonization and land dispossession, we have residential/boarding school systems. Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and placed into boarding schools designed to assimilate them into Euro-American, Euro-Canadian culture. These schools banned Indigenous languages and cultures while also contributing physical and emotional abuse, described as cultural genocide. Federal reports confirmed thousands of children died while attending U.S. boarding schools, and abuse contributed to trauma and loss for families and communities. The first example that comes to mind is Haskell University, which was a once boarding school that's located in Lawrence, Kansas, and now has turned into a university that accepts Indigenous students from up to 1/16th Native American to be accepted into the school and receive that reduced price education. Okay, so following residential/boarding school systems, we have family community disruption. So within that, it says that practices such as the 60s scoop in Canada, which was the mass removal of Aboriginal children from their families into the child welfare system, and child welfare policies separated Indigenous children from their families. This reinforced cycles of trauma, and research shows that familial residential school exposure correlated heavily with later involvement in child welfare systems, reflecting intergenerational impacts. So, following the family community disruption, we are lastly going to look at erasure of language and culture. That seems like a pretty familiar one for most, but it had really detrimental impacts in terms of the intergenerational trauma that we see span the course of Indigenous people's lives. So, this specifically is the suppressing of Indigenous languages, ceremonies, and identities, which ultimately weakened the cultural continuity and community cohesion, feeding into forced assimilation once again. So, there's a common theme of assimilation occurring within the intergenerational trauma endured. After learning about what types of collective trauma the population has possibly encountered, we have to look at what is important about this context. Again, I broke this up into 4 different sections that I felt like were really important and kind of we've touched on before. So, historical trauma being the first. Historical trauma is a massive collective trauma affecting whole groups and is passed down through families and communities, affecting emotional well-being and the ability to socialize across generations. This trauma is not just history from the past because its effects are seen today in patterns of health, mental health, and community dynamics. Following historical trauma, there are health impacts, both mental and physical wise. So, studies have linked historical trauma with depression, substance use, and psychological stress in Indigenous populations, demonstrating ongoing trauma's impact. Biological research suggests that trauma experienced by one generation, like parents attending residential schools, can correlate with the biological stress markers in future generations to come. Following our health impacts, we have the cultural erasure and identity loss. Disrupted shared generational cultural knowledge, such as language, practices, and values, contribute to identity challenges and community disconnection. So, a loss of language, culture, and traditional roles amplifies feelings of powerlessness and grief shared across generations. Once again, going back to this concept of forced assimilation and what that looks like for generations to come. Lastly, in terms of context, we can't disregard the healing, resilience, and cultural continuity that exist. While trauma endures, Indigenous communities also pursue healing through cultural revitalization, community leadership, and resilience practices. Recognition and documentation of trauma, like truth and reconciliation efforts, are important steps towards acknowledgement and healing for these cultures, as well as just overall acknowledging the culture for what it is and the practices that have so heavily influenced other practices that have come to be since. Now that we have a better understanding of the population, their region, and the collective trauma they've experienced, Chloe will discuss some of the root causes behind intergenerational trauma and the types of issues that may impact Indigenous people.
Hi, this is Chloe. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the larger systemic root causes of this trauma. Indigenous communities in the US and Canada have experienced trauma rooted in centuries of colonization, not just a single event. European colonization was built on the assumption that Indigenous land could be claimed and redistributed to settlers. Indigenous people themselves do not believe that land is something to be owned, but is a sacred relative, according to Braveheart. Policies and military actions resulted in forced displacement from ancestral lands, treaty violations, and land theft, which disrupted cultural, political, and family systems. Government policies in both the United States and Canada attempted to eliminate Indigenous cultural identities and replace them with Euro-American and Euro-Canadian norms. Like Sophia explained earlier, these policies included boarding and residential schools that removed children from their families and banned Indigenous languages and spiritual practices. Both the US and Canadian governments also signed treaties with Indigenous nations that promised land rights, sovereignty, and protection. However, many of these agreements were repeatedly violated or ignored, which contributed to deep distrust of government institutions that still exist in this population today. The economic disparities we see in Indigenous communities today are closely tied to historical policies that restricted land ownership, economic development, and access to resources. Reservation systems in the United States and reserve systems in Canada confined Indigenous peoples to lands that were often geographically isolated and economically limited. These policies disrupted traditional economies and limited opportunities for long-term economic growth. As a result, Indigenous communities continue to face significant economic disparities. In the United States, the poverty rate for Native Americans is about 25%, nearly double the national average. Many tribal communities also experience higher unemployment rates and limited access to infrastructure such as safe housing, healthcare, and transportation. In Canada, First Nations people living on reserves experience poverty rates more than twice as high as the national average, and many communities face ongoing housing shortages and infrastructure gaps. These structural inequalities contribute to long-term barriers to economic mobility and reinforce cycles of poverty across generations. In the United States, one of the most devastating examples of this systemic oppression is the Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized President Andrew Jackson to negotiate the removal of Native nations to lands west of the Mississippi River. Some tribes accepted this act, while others, like the Cherokee, living in what is now the state of Georgia, as you can see on the picture in this slide, resisted. Even though the Supreme Court recognized Cherokee sovereignty, the group was forcibly removed by the U.S. government in the fall and winter of 1838 to 1839. The Cherokee were made to march over 1,000 miles west to Oklahoma over the course of 6 months. 1 in 4 people died from the hardships on their forced march, which included disease and extreme winter weather. This is also the story of other southeastern nations like the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, who were removed before the Cherokee. You might be wondering, what is the impact of this continual oppression, marginalization, and genocide of Indigenous people? The answer is multifaceted, since trauma cannot be confined to one part of a person, but impacts them and the generations after them significantly. Some of the mental and psychological impacts that research links historical trauma among Indigenous populations to are higher rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance use disorders, and suicide, particularly among Indigenous youth. These patterns are often connected to unresolved historical trauma and systemic stressors that persist today. Some behavioral and social impacts that intergenerational trauma can influence are a distrust of government institutions due to past abuse experienced by those institutions, interpersonal conflicts linked to unresolved trauma, difficulty accessing or trusting healthcare and social services, and family disruption caused by historical child removal policies. Many Indigenous communities also face structural barriers that contribute to ongoing inequities. These include underfunded schools on reservations or reserves, limited access to healthcare services, geographic isolation in rural areas, higher rates of poverty and housing insecurity, and jurisdictional issues that complicate legal protections. These barriers are not individual failures, but are rooted in historical policy decisions. Despite the challenges this group has faced throughout history, Indigenous communities demonstrate strong resilience. In order to be better social workers, we must understand the trauma and resilience that Indigenous people bring into interactions with us.
Thank you, Chloe. As we move on to important strategies to consider with intervening in collective trauma situations, I think first and foremost, it's important to have a knowledge and understanding of the collective and intergenerational trauma that has been endured by the Indigenous population. I believe there's no room for or no excuse for ignorance when it comes to developing appropriate, culturally sensitive interventions. We must be aware of the history that has preceded that trauma. From there, we ask where these strategies actually should come from. And it's my belief that any and all strategies must come directly from the community involvement. Our role, or the role of an organization or government as an outsider to that community, must, regardless of their professional experience, must be one of assistance and support, not of mandating or direct leadership. Now, as we move forward to specific strategies or interventions that may be used within the context of intergenerational trauma amongst the indigenous population within the United States, two that came to mind to the forefront were the resilience framework and the strengths-based approach. Now, cultural resilience and strengths-based approach are not foreign concepts to indigenous communities. And so, in many ways, it may provide a sort of harmonious blend between the traditional values of indigenous cultures and more modern evidence-based approaches. And as we see in the quote by Ryman, when it comes to creating these tailor-made interventions, it is important first and foremost to analyze the local culture and the context-specific coping and resilience mechanisms in order to understand how they deal with trauma. Now, this table highlights some of the many cultural differences between what can be considered traditional indigenous values and our more contemporary Western European capitalist approach to the world. If we look specifically, we can see that many of the traditional indigenous values are actually in near direct contrast with our contemporary quote-unquote American values. We see examples such as harmony with nature versus power over nature, or the importance of the collective versus the individual. Now, I do want to preface this to say that indigenous culture may take many forms, and as we saw on the maps before, this is a people that once spanned the entire continent with many different tribes, customs, and cultures. So while these do provide some broader values, it is always important to identify specific values of the community one is working with. Now, when it comes to intervening and beginning to allow healing from the intergenerational trauma, one step may be offering community-based strategies that are more in line with values of the indigenous communities. And I think it should be said as well that based on the potential lack of appropriate representation within research, contemporary evidence-based practices should be examined with a more culturally critical eye before attempting to incorporate it as a mode of practice. Now, when it comes to the role of program development, the role of governments, NGOs, or institutions, as we have discussed earlier and as we have seen throughout the entirety of the presentation, it is important to note the potential role that institutional betrayal and betrayal trauma may have had on the indigenous population within the United States. We have seen through the earlier slides of countless and numerous acts in which the U.S. government and by proxy institutions, programs, even social workers designed to provide advocacy and support have continually betrayed and neglected the well-being of Indigenous Americans. And so because of this, there is the possibility to consider the skepticism or lack of trust that this population may have in quote-unquote official institutions or organizations to adequately provide support or aid. Now, this doesn't mean that program development through institutions or governments doesn't have its place, but it must be carefully considered in its implementation. As was discussed in interventions, should program development be integrated with direct community involvement with input from community leaders, advocates, peer specialists, there is a way forward. Program development must tread this path of recognizing and understanding the trauma of the past, and then moving forward with the action of honoring the present and the future. One such example of a program that has served to help reduce some of the mental health disparities of Indigenous groups and youths have been wellness centers that are based on Indigenous cultural concepts of healing, as well as culture and language immersion schools that are tradition-based and help promote Native youth development and community resilience. We see how this once again ties into the resilience framework as well as the strengths-based approach, highlighting the positive values, tying in again with the traditional aspects of their culture, all the while as well allowing them to build community and resilience. Now, within all of this, what is the role of the social worker? As always, I do believe that social workers find themselves in a bit of a unique position to assist with the development and integration of said programs due to training focused around analyzing and understanding a systematic and historical lens of intergenerational trauma, understanding intersectionality of identities, as well as the ability to incorporate a person in environment approach. Such an approach, I think, is vital to moving forward and incorporating effective, culturally competent practices and interventions. As has been discussed throughout the presentation, program development must be handled very carefully, particularly with the indigenous population in the United States, because of the history of trauma and abuse suffered at the hands of official and government organizations. The role of social workers within this particular community should and could be one of bridging the gap between the program and then the individuals it is meant to assist.
Thanks for your insight, Alberto. Let's see if through this presentation the audience has learned the cause of the collective trauma experienced by the indigenous North Americans. Say it with me now. Colonialism and racism. Oh. As mentioned, the American and Canadian states and the colonies that preceded them engaged in systematic ethnic cleansing and cultural cleansing. Indigenous peoples were forcibly removed from their lands or killed. Their children were taken from their families and placed in residential schools designed to erase their languages, spiritual practices, and cultural identities. So when we ask what could have prevented this, the simple answer is the prevention of colonialism. But if we set aside that foundational answer and think about harm reduction as us social workers do, we come to the answer of honoring our treaties. The colonizing Americans signed, then broke 370 treaties before 1871, let alone the hundreds signed since. These treaties were agreements that established protected lands, legal rights, and peaceful coexistence. And by breaking them, we brought about the antithesis to all of those things. We brought about trauma. It is time we turn our focus from the past to the future. But before I talk about a pathway forward, I want to go more into depth about the cycle of intergenerational trauma and how it's passed on. To expand on what Sophia said earlier, the first way this trauma passes on is biological. Research in epigenetics shows that severe prolonged trauma can alter gene expressions in ways that are heritable. Children of trauma survivors may be born with dysregulated stress response systems, inheriting things like hyper or hypoactive stress responses and elevated cortisol without any direct exposure to the original traumatic events. The second pathway is relational and developmental. Parents who experience trauma and have unresolved grief, hypervigilance, or complex PTSD may struggle with emotional attunement, not for lack of love or effort, but because their own nervous systems are in chronic survival mode. This disrupts secure attachment, and we know from attachment theory that insecure or disorganized attachment in early childhood predicts poorer emotional regulation, increased vulnerability to trauma, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. The third pathway is cultural and communal. When an entire community experiences systematic destruction of its language, spiritual practices, and traditional support systems, the normal channels of collective healing can disappear. There is no one to hold ceremony. There is no language to name what has been lost. The grief becomes wordless and is passed down not through story, but through silence. Through a culture embedded with chronic stress forced upon them. This is the cycle. Trauma impairs caregiving capacity, which disrupts attachment, which increases vulnerability to trauma, which compounds community-level dysfunction, which perpetuates worsening conditions of poverty, housing instability, criminalization, and substance use. These conditions expose the next generation to further adversity. It is not a moral failing. It is a predictable outcome of prolonged unaddressed collective trauma operating across a historically and actively oppressed community. So, the first option for what happens now, and the one we're currently closest to, is we allow the status quo to continue. That means inadequate funding for Indigenous health and mental health services, means allowing reservation-based communities to remain in conditions of poverty within one of the wealthiest nations on earth, means continuing to make and break promises. Who here remembers the Dakota Access Pipeline protest in Standing Rock in 2016? The pipeline was rerouted away from Bismarck, a predominantly white city, because of concerns about water contamination, and then routed directly under the Missouri River through sacred burial grounds and on the edge of the Standing Rock Reservation. Despite years of legal protest and international tension, construction proceeded. The message sent to Indigenous communities was familiar. Your land, your water, your graves, these are acceptable collateral damage. Clinically speaking, the status quo is re-traumatization. The second option, the harder, longer, more necessary one, is to actively work to interrupt the cycle of intergenerational trauma on a micro, meso, and macro scale. At the individual and family level, it means trauma-informed, culturally grounded, therapeutic interventions. The evidence increasingly supports approaches that integrate Western clinical modalities like trauma-focused CBT, EMDR, and somatic therapies with Indigenous healing practices like community circles, land-based healing, ceremony, and involvement of elders. Critically, these services must be community-led. A non-native therapist deploying a standard trauma protocol without understanding cultural context is not trauma-informed care. At the family and community level, it means supporting secure attachment through parent-child intervention programs that are grounded in Indigenous relational values, where extended community networks are recognized as legitimate caregiving systems, not deficits to be corrected. It means reforming child welfare systems that still disproportionately remove Indigenous children from their families at rates far exceeding any other demographic group. And at the structural level, breaking the cycle requires addressing social determinants that perpetuate vulnerability. Just to list a few we need to address: housing, food, tribal sovereignty, access to clean water, educational self-determinants, economic development, and healthcare parity. And that is far from an exhaustive list. I want to close with two things that deserve more than an honorable mention, but given it's 8:57, or close to it, I don't know, I'm a recording. I'll make these brief. First, reparations. There's a growing body of scholarship and advocacy around reparations for Indigenous people. A legal and moral acknowledgement of what was taken: land, resources, cultural heritage, lives. A meaningful reparations framework would include material restitution, land-back policies where feasible, funding for language and cultural revitalization programs, investment in Indigenous-led healing infrastructure. We can make this case not as a radical ask, but as a logical extension of what trauma-informed practices require: acknowledgement, accountability, and repair. Second, stop re-traumatizing. This means honoring the treaties that exist. It means applying the free, prior, and informed consent standard before any development on or near Indigenous lands. It means not needing a protest at Standing Rock to be reminded that Indigenous lives and sacred sites are worth protecting. The most powerful thing that could happen now is not a new program or a new policy, is the nation finally deciding to keep its word. The cycle of intergenerational trauma is not inevitable. It was created by deliberate policy choices, and it can be interrupted through deliberate practice, deliberate policy, and the willingness to sit with the discomfort of historical accountability. That is the work, and it starts with us. If anything makes me hopeful, is that the people in this class are the next generation of social workers. We really enjoyed making this presentation for you, and we all really just wanted to say thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for listening.